So is the wokeism and the kind of cancel culture, is that a regression to the mean? Is this a thing where people this is just kind of the way societies are and we got out of it for a while?
I don't think it's quite the same. I don't think it's like super unusual, but this one seems like it's sort of more cyclical, where at least in the United States, you sort of get waves of this sort of thing, where like this one is still not as intense as the last. So like people talk about the sort of 90s political correctness wave and when they're talking about this. The sort of the last sort of really big hysterical wave like this that was like really, really big was the like whole like anti-communist McCarthyist stuff, which like the current wave, there is a core real thing that they're objecting to and correct about and is a big deal. And then like the McCarthyist stuff, the way that it's being talked about is just like really unmoored from the realities of the thing that they're trying to object to and trying to accomplish. And it leads to this sort of like, you know, like the sorts of patterns that we see and the way that it gets unmoored and epistemically ends up causing a bunch of issues. So
let me stop you, because you used an example that I have clouded understanding of, right? Like I used to think the Senator McCarthy hearings were, you know, him standing up and being an absolute lunatic, running people out on a rail because there were communists. But I also have heard stories where people are like, no, there really were communists and they weren't his hearings. He was just a person that spoke at them, and they had actually found Russian agents inside of the government and they were expelling them. So which of those two versions is your version of the past, and how does that apply to the wokeism culture that we're talking about today?
So my understanding of McCarthyism, I haven't looked super, super deeply, but my picture is that both of those are pretty correct. There were, in fact, a bunch of communist agents, or I guess it would be more accurate to say Soviet sympathizers within the government and within high cultural positions. And also McCarthy was a like raving loon who was often accusing people on the basis of basically no evidence. And, you know, a while later, like not too long after, there were a bunch of intercepted communications that the United States spies got, which like found a bunch of highly placed agents. A few decades later, those got declassified. And some of the people who McCarthy was accusing are on those lists. A bunch of them aren't. So what I think was probably happening was that he was listening to a bunch of people who, some of them knew things and some of them were just bullshitting. And he didn't really care that much. And he just wanted to make a spectacle. And it's a lot easier to do that when there's at least a germ of truth. And like it happened in that case that some of the people he accused, it was basically right or basically partly right. And others were sort of like maybe hanging around in those circles, maybe the type of academic who you would associate with that because a bunch of those academics were sympathetic, but he didn't really know in the specific cases.
That's interesting. I mean, I see that going on right now. I mean, there are conspiracies that go on in the U.S., and some of them people point out. But oftentimes, if you're in whatever conspiracy theory network or hangout group, I mean, their ideas are totally unmoored from reality. And so you have this great mixture of the two. And that definitely seems to be happening right now.
Right. Because, like, you know, sometimes people do conspire. And also a lot of the times people have these really unhinged, they're more hysterias than theories about like how the things are, like what the actual contents of those conspiracies are. And it's often pretty tricky to actually go through and check which ones have something to them and which ones are just nuts.
Okay, so let's get back, because you were telling me about, you had these thoughts about institutions and how they are not as healthy as they were, but that was actually leading you to a point about what you're actually thinking about lately.
Right, which is what do you do to plant the seeds of an institutional revival that can take us to, you could call it another golden age, you could call it like healthier institutions, but like how do you like get it so that all of these disparate parts, the government, academia, the industry, I focus a lot on the industry, are one, working well according to their own rules, which part of the challenge is that the rules are actually quite different. The things you want your academics doing are quite different from what you want your industrialists doing, are quite different from what you want your politicians doing. So how do you get a group of people who can be good each individually in their own spheres and also who can work together well? Because one of the things you find when you look at any era that's doing really well in these ways, whether it be the United States at its height, or like the Roman Empire or the Han Dynasty or whatever, like you will find that these elites are relatively good at getting along with each other and pretty good inside their own domains. So I think the thing you need is to just get people who are good enough. And so how do you plant that seed? How do you get those people? How do you get that group started?
And is your imagination that this is a giant group, or is this a small group? Is this something that has to happen over and over and over again? Or is it one giant conference that happens and then people go forth and start the revival?
Yeah, so I think it's a slow grind that starts small and eventually becomes medium-sized. And I don't think it ends up necessarily permeating like 98% of the population or whatever. But I think you do need like skilled leaders in the important domains. And like, I think if you had several thousand people who are highly skilled and able to work together well, then that would do it.
You're reminding me of a thing. There's a guy named Jim Rutt who has been working on a program called Game B, and your model here seems to be a very good one to overlay over the top of their organizational ideas. You're familiar with Jim Rutt?
Yeah, like a bunch of my friends and a bunch of the people in the Game B area talk to each other. We've been learning a bunch from each other, absolutely.
It seems to make a lot of sense. I'm struck, so I run a network of my own, and I am struck by just how disconnected people are from the people that they live right next door to. Certainly this happens in apartments. I lived in apartments where I didn't know the people that lived across the hall or next to me. But right. It's an even more unsettling thing when you're living in a neighborhood and you don't know your neighbors. And I think that people are really hungry for that, but the institutions that used to facilitate that, which would have been church and probably some civic groups, they just don't exist anymore. And so you don't have people practicing on the local level. You don't have the T-ball and the sports complex to bring people up at their skill level so they can then go on up another level. And so I see people trying very hard to try and figure out how to fix it on the community level.
Yeah, and like this is a really interesting one to me, actually, especially here in Oakland. Like Oakland does have a whole lot of this, Oakland has a fair amount of this type of civic infrastructure, but the class dynamics of it are really interesting, where like you will see that the people doing that tend to be like lower middle class, and people with this sort of upper class aspirations just like aren't really involved in it, which is sort of the opposite of what it was in my grandfather's time.
Yeah, so there's a guy named David Goodhart that has this concept of somewhere versus anywhere people. And the elites of our society, the ones that get educated, they say, hey, I want to travel. I want to have a job where I can pick up and move anywhere I want. I want to be able to have transactional relationships because I can buy anything I need, versus somewhere people who are much less transactional. And their role is really like, I'm here not because it's the best job opportunities or the best place for me to make money, but instead I like the relationships here. I'm comfortable. I don't want a lot of change. And that what David's concept is that we really are stratifying between somewhere and anywhere people. And once he named that, it really made a lot of sense to me. And I personally am probably an anywhere person that's converting right now into a somewhere person.
Yeah. And when you look at this from the perspective of like rising elites, it's sort of tricky to do that if you are purely in the sort of anywhere mode, because at some point you have to sort of build up a substantial power base that is yours, that is not like, sort of lent to you because you're the undersecretary of whatever, or like the department head of this or that, and can be taken away, or you're just going to give up when you do your lateral move to get your, pay increase or whatever. Like, if you want to like really end up rising, you need something that is fundamentally yours. And 100 years ago, a lot of this was a sort of like local civic infrastructure, the local party machines that sort of arose from the physical location. When you see people rising today, sometimes it's local in that way. Sometimes it's some other thing that they sort of made a really big bet on in a way that's sort of counter to this sort of infinite fungibility, infinite optionality ethos that you see in a lot of these anywhere people. And sort of like the question of when do you make that bet is like a really hard one, I think.
Yeah, and I think like if you looked at people in the past, you'd say, hey, look, the guy that spent 3 or 4 years away and then came back and was a somewhere person, look how well he did. Now what happens if you extend that a little further? Maybe I can keep my optionality open for 7, 8, 9 years, and then I'll go put my roots down. And you start seeing, because my wife and I'm nearly 40. We just had our first daughter. And, there were my parents were saying, you guys are going to be the only older parents around like that. But no, when we go to see other, like playgrounds, all the parents are in their 40s that I see.
Yeah.
Thanks for checking out this podcast short. If you like this interview, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button and hit that bell so you always get notified about this podcast. And if you're really interested in conversations like this, you may want to consider joining the Articulate Ventures Network. To find out more, go to network.articulate.ventures.